Welcome to the Deep Probe, the first in a series of videos in which we deeply probe the 3rd edition Kings of War rulebook. This time, the rules changes as compared to 2nd edition. But of course I'm not going to make you stare at this rather magnificently photoshopped thumbnail all the way through the video. Hello there, I hold in my hands a mighty tome indeed. Look at the thickness and the rigidity of this beast. That is quite magnificent. Compare it to, let's say, the last Clash of Kings book, for example. Let's just have a look at the comparative sizes, shall we? So maybe it's a bit unfair because this is only a supplement, but I can assure you that the actual full-size Kings of War rulebook from the previous edition is nowhere near as meaty as this. I'm not quite going to call it a monstrosity because that makes it sound a little bit negative, I think. But it is mighty indeed, and you could kill people with this. Not that you should. The only things that you should be killing are your opponent's models after pouring through this book, absorbing the rules into your mind, and then applying the tactical lessons on the battlefield that you learn on this channel. And hello to everyone who's in the chat right now. A couple of people commenting away before the video actually started. Got Matt and Russell in there already. And I hope that everyone who's actually got their hands on this beast already has it to hand right now. And they're going to open it and follow along with what we're doing here, because we're going to be going through each page of the rules section and discussing any changes that have come up. There are going to be a few in there that I haven't spotted in my notes probably. And they're most likely to be changes by omission. There'll be things that were specifically mentioned in 2nd edition that just haven't been mentioned here because they no longer apply and this is a brand new edition. So you don't need to point out all the rules that have gone. But that makes them the hardest to spot. So, John is in the chat as well and says hey to everyone. So, let's just get comfy here. I've got the rule book and you're going to be looking at me leaning forward like this reading book quite a lot. So I hope you enjoy that sight. And I've also got a notebook right here full of some words of wisdom that I've put down there on my first couple of reads through of the rule book. And I haven't gone into it multiple times. It normally takes maybe about 14 times reading through a rule book to absorb absolutely everything. And then even then, it tends not to stick fully until you've actually played a few games. I've only played one game of 3rd edition so far, which I did record the entire thing as well. So that's going to be up at some point. It needs a bit of editing just to chop out any of the pauses where we're looking at the rulebook though. Let's see. Matt says, am I going to make a ding sound when you want us to turn the page? No. That might get annoying, but I'm going to tell you which page we're on. So I think we should start with the getting started section, which is on page 8, anyone who's following along. So we're not going to go into the specifics of any of the army lists in this one, maybe a little bit. But I'm going to do full videos on each of the armies that I am personally invested in, and then probably another video just on all the other armies that I don't personally play or have never played, because I won't have as much to say about those, so it's not going to be quite as in-depth. It'll still be quite a deep probe though, maybe more of a just below the surface level probe, not quite as deep as the Goblin one's going to be pretty deep, let me tell you. So on page 8 in the getting started section, I don't think there's anything really in here that is a huge difference from the previous edition. Tells you what you need to play, tells you what kind of dice you need, explains what modifiers and rerolls are. Now you can never reroll a reroll, although any tournament that ever has a tournament reroll where you get one dice that you can reroll throughout the entire game, they usually say this ignores the you can never reroll a reroll rule, which is fun to say. Okay. Let's skip straight past page 8 then, shall we? And onto page 10, because there's actually a little bit of interesting stuff on here. There are 1 or 2 changes on this page. First thing to note is that infantry and heavy infantry are classified as 2 different things now, which I think is really for the purposes of letting you know what kind of base something is supposed to be on. Because previously, for example, an orc or a goblin would both be considered infantry, but then you would have to look in the book and see that the orcs have a special all models in this army are on 25mm square bases. I think that's how they did it for anything that was the exception to the 20mm base rule. And as the more armies came out, you tended to see more more armies that needed the 25mm base. So I can understand the difference in the classification there. And it also allows, if they wanted to bring in rules in the future, I'm not sure if there's actually any in here that do differentiate between regular infantry and heavy infantry, but they would be able to do that in the future. They would be able to have, for example, a spell or something else that only applies to infantry or to heavy infantry. So if there's a particular beast that likes stepping on things, then it might get a bonus versus regular infantry, but not heavy infantry because they're too big. So that would make sense, wouldn't it? So I don't know whether that actually affects anything in this book, but it may do in the future. If not, it leaves it open for them to do so. Let's see. Tale of an Wargamer. Hope at some point you look at Abyssal Dwarves. Yes, I will definitely be looking at the Abyssal Dwarves because that's the army I'm going to be playing first in 3rd edition. There's still one more 2nd edition tournament to do though, so I don't want to completely brainwash myself too much with these rules, even though it's probably too late for that. I'm going to be forgetting what I'm doing in a couple of weeks' time at that event. Basin, also in there. Probing time, yes, it certainly is. So we're on page 10 at the moment, my fellow probers. The book is the Probe E, we are the probers. So anything else to note on here? I'm not sure whether chariots were their own unit type before. They may well have been classed as large cavalry previously, I don't remember. But they're definitely separate now because there are some rules that affect cavalry, large cavalry, but not chariots specifically. For example, phalanx, which we'll get to later. And there's also the titans, which are different from monsters, and that just means they come on a bigger base. So it's really just for the big giant monsters that Mantic made, and they made them way too big to fit on a 50mm. Whether they did that for any kind of in-game rules reason, they intentionally made them that large, or whether it was just easier for them to create these miniatures that were just gigantic, and they just happened to not fit on 50mm bases, so they've then kind of written the rules around that later on, which would make sense. They still have the exceptional base sizes rule in there, so if you've got a model that's just an absolute gargantuan beast, like for example if you're using this rulebook as a miniature, it definitely wouldn't fit on 75mm, even though it's clearly a titan. So you would have to follow the exceptional base sizes rule there. And you may know if you've seen my ogres, which are not actual ogre models, the giant I use does not fit on a 75mm base, it's too big. Unless I maybe cut it off the round base instead of blue tacking the round base onto the square base, which is what I was doing in the past. So that is where I've used the exceptional base size rule in the past. And I've actually done that with my giants in my goblin army as well, which is an interesting thing that giants, regular giants, are not really a thing anymore. So the 50mm based giants kind of don't exist unless I've missed something in the book to this point. So mine are actually based on 60mm bases, I think, because they just wouldn't fit. Well, one of them wouldn't, and then I just made them all to match. So if I wanted to continue using them, I would just have to put them on top of a 75mm base, although they are a bit small compared to the new ones. So what I'll probably do is finish putting this bad boy together, so he's not just legs and a torso, and use that, paint that up to match my goblin army, because I think that's the only army I've got that really needs a giant, I think. Abyssal Dwarves certainly don't have one, and the models I use as ogres, which are actually Stormcast, as sacrilegious as that is, they certainly don't need one because I've already got their colossal giant. So I think we can skip past this, kind of. Although, at the Titan and Monster, there aren't a huge amount of actual regular monsters now compared to Titans. Just going through the army list, I saw a lot of Titans. There's not a huge amount of monsters. So there's going to be a lot of things on the big 75mm bases, most of which Mantic make, including the really big, the elemental type model, and the big dragons they've made are all on 75mm. Okay, that's unit types. If anyone has any comments, by the way, as we're continuing our probing session, then drop them in there, because there's going to be things that I've missed or observations that other pairs of eyeballs are going to pick up either before me or just from a slightly different angle from where I'm looking at things. So if anyone has anything to add on unit types, feel free to drop it in there. And let's move straight onto page 12, onto unit footprints, movement trays, and multibases. There's not too much to be said about this, really. Again, it specifies the heavy infantry base size compared to regular infantry, and the footprints of everything, and the preferred model count as well, which is a bit of a hot topic at the moment, because there's no mention of minimum model count in this book that I've found, and I don't think anyone has found it, and that's caused some people to be concerned that maybe that wasn't a thing anymore, and you just wouldn't be able to participate in tournaments if you weren't following preferred model count, which on some units is actually quite difficult. But that is not the case. Minimum model count is still a thing, just not putting it in the book is, of course, hopefully it's going to encourage people to put more models on their multi-bases. Because if you present someone with the option and say you can actually only have this many, for example, a horde of 40, you can get away with 21, then people are generally going to do that because it's going to be cheaper and it's going to be easier to fit them all on there. But if you just say, well, here's the preferred model count, here's what we'd like you to do, then they're probably going to lean that way if you actually don't show them what the lower limit is. And there are certain units that are easy to make up in the preferred model count. I'm looking at cavalry, for example. I've never had trouble fitting 4 cavalry onto a base instead of 5, and that's a perfectly acceptable number there. And chariots can potentially be a slight problem, because you've seen, for example, Goblin Mincer, or I think a lot of the Mantic chariots use kind of the same base or the same wheels, the same frame. A lot of them barely fit against each other. You kind of have to tilt them outwards a bit or have one slightly behind the other on the base for them to fit. So it can be done, it's just not that easy. So I can see people not being pleased with the preferred model count for chariots. That's going to be quite tricky to fit them all on. I've seen some interesting dioramas where people have got one crashed chariot, so it allows you to have just half of a model on the base, which obviously takes up less space than a full model. See, got Bob and Fluffy Dread in the chat. Hello there. Anything else to touch on in the unit footprints section? If anyone has anything else to drop in on any of these topics, by the way, feel free. I'm staring at the chat intermittently. And they give you some examples on the other page there. Multi-basing and scenic basing, the differences between those, and movement trays. I'm not a fan of movement trays in Kings of War for individual bases, because there is that little bit of a lip, which actually, in the rules now, there is something in there about not being in base-to-base contact with your own units. So whether that makes it easier or makes it even more annoying, having a little lip on the edge of the movement tray, I don't know. But I very much prefer multi-basing, scenic basing, and if you're going to have a movement tray, if you've seen what my undead are like, where the movement tray is actually the correct size for the unit, and then you just have slightly less models inside the movement tray, it is possible to do that. I think I did custom order those from one of the movement tray or base manufacturers. It may have been War Bases. That's usually where I get that kind of thing from. So if you're going to do movement trays, keep that in mind. If there is going to be a lip, make sure it's not significant. Okay, let's move on. Now, this is where it starts to get juicy, I think. So we're now on to page 14, and we're on to the unit characteristics. I suppose it doesn't get too juicy here, apart from the fact that unit strength, for a start, is now in their stats, in the unit stats. So you don't have to just have a regulation unit strength for a particular type. So it's not just a regiment is this, a horde is this. It's now that specific unit has their own strength, which makes sense because you don't have to bring in all these different things like a unit has lower unit strength if they're nimble and large cavalry and all these different things, or their unit strength is reduced by 1 if it's a full moon and all this kind of nonsense. So they just have their plain old unit strength right there on the unit. It just tells you how much each unit is worth as a part of their stat line, which I like. Makes things nice and simple, and they can get rid of all those silly exceptions that everyone forgot about anyway. And then at the end of the game, when you were totaling up who won the invade scenario, you would find out, actually, that unit I've got in there is only worth 2, not 3, so I actually lose the game. So that kind of thing did happen quite frequently. So I can see why they've cleared that up, made that nice and simple. I like that. Height has changed a bit as well. Everything's basically jumped up by 1. And that just allows them a little bit more leeway, because there were height 0 units, which people found really confusing. And then what made that even more confusing was that height 0 units were different to something that was flat. So height 0, you could get cover if you were behind it, because 0 is technically a number, but flat isn't a number, so it didn't give any cover. So they've bumped everything up in height, and there isn't a height 0 anymore. Anything else on this page that we want to touch on? I think everything else is pretty much the same. There's not really any changes with the front arcs. Line of sight, I don't think, has taken a significant change. There are distance measuring changes, though, which we'll get to in a moment when we get to the charge section. And the turn with movement, ranged and melee, there's been no change there. No extra phases sneaking their way in there to complicate the game. Let's see. Christopher says, a chariot and 2 horses with a rider is 4 models by itself, right? Well, that would be a little bit of a loophole if that was the case, but I'm pretty sure you wouldn't be able to get away with that. And I've rarely seen minimum model count actually enforced at an event in the first place. If you were trying to enter Clash of Kings or another Mantic organised event, then definitely. But everyone else is pretty generous with it. I think as long as you're not just sticking a goblin in the middle of your horde tray with no bits of terrain or anything on there, then you're generally fine. If you have to ask whether it's silly and not acceptable, then generally it's not acceptable. If it looks good to you, it's probably good enough, and you know deep down whether it looks good. If you've got 1 less model on there than the minimum model count, but you've also got beautiful kind of terrain on the base, and you've set up a little diorama where they're chopping somebody's head off or something, and they're all gathered around cheering, then I think people are generally going to let you off with that. Just don't expect to be winning trips around the world at Mantic events, because you've got to abide by those rules. Right, so movement phase, and in my little notes book here, the first major change I've got is on the charging, but on the actual movement, there is an extra form of movement that you can do now, which is disengaging. And that is because when you charge into the enemy and you do not remove them from the game, you now do not bounce back an inch, which arguably the biggest change in the rules is that. Off the top of my head, I think it definitely is the biggest change. It's going to affect the way the game's played more than any of the other changes. And it also means that there's a rule for you to pull away an inch from the enemy now at the start of your turn, provided you meet certain criteria. Let's see. Fluffy Dread says, does the book have rules for armies like Ratkin in it, or will we need another book for those? Yes, there will be another book coming for all the additional armies that Mantic don't actually make models for, and that's going to be in a month or 2. It's going to drop, I think. I think it's called the Armies of Panithor, which is the name of the land. I think that's within the land of Mantic. I haven't actually delved into the fluff section yet. We may do a deep probe on that at some point, provided I actually read it. I should do, really, because when you've got a meaty tome like this, you should really absorb everything from it and get everything into your mind from within there. I mean, look at the thickness of that. It's just pure juice seeping out. You don't want to leave anything on the plate, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so when you're disengaging from an enemy unit that's just charged you, most likely, and is touching your unit, so you can now touch enemy units. You don't have to be an inch away at all times because of this change. So you still can't go within an inch when you're doing your regular move or any of that stuff. But when charging, of course, that's going to change because you don't have to bounce. So you can fall back from the enemy unit 1 inch, provided you haven't also been charged on another facing. However, if the unit that's charged you on another facing is an individual, a yielding individual, which we'll get to as well, then they can't prevent you from doing so. And really, after you've done your disengage, you can then carry on as normal as you would have done previously. So if you're nimble and you're able to pivot on the spot, you could still do your corkscrew charges and charging around corners and all that kind of thing with your nimble ability, because there is going to be that inch gap that you've created. So if you want to stop units from being able to do any of those shenanigans, you have ways of stopping them now by charging them on multiple facings, which is going to stop them from pulling out, as it were, and it means that they'll have to stay where they are and fight one of the units that you charge them with. And so charging, probably the second biggest change I can think of right now is the fact that measurements for charges are no longer taken from the leader point of the unit. They're taken from any point along the frontage, along that front facing, anywhere on there to any point on the enemy unit, to the closest point. And that's going to significantly boost the wider units, for example, the big infantry hordes, even cavalry hordes. Anything that's wide, and cavalry hordes now just have a huge area that they can threaten. And those units were a little bit underappreciated in the past. The people were able to use them, but it was difficult to get them into a good spot, and it always seemed better just to have a couple of smaller units of cavalry. But now I could see hordes being more useful with that extra threat range on them. And infantry hordes that were previously very slow and could only threaten a very tiny area, you could even get pretty close to them sometimes. If we're talking dwarven infantry horde, you can actually get fairly close and still be out of their charge range because of the positioning of the leader point. So if you were just towards the flank, then it was quite easy for those kind of silly situations to come up where they're really close to you, but a charge isn't legal. But now it can be done. So just measure anywhere from the front, and you can charge them provided they're in your front arc, of course. So there's still room for avoiding charges. Steve has joined us in the chat and says, evening. We're on our deep probe here, and we're currently on page 18 on the units movement, and page 19 with the charging. And is there anything else on here we need to cover in this page? Anything else in my notes here? So I mentioned a little bit before about not having base contact with friendly units anymore. So it actually specifies not to do that. I'm not sure whether it did in the previous edition, because you would often see people line up and put their units right next to each other, and then once they've run through the army list, most players generally don't have it memorized very well. So if you've got two regiments right next to each other that look the same and they're moving up, touching each other, you can quite easily mistake them for a horde until one of them charges off on its own and you think, what's going on here? I thought I'd blocked that unit. Oh wait, it's two regiments, not a horde. So battle plan out the window. So it actually specifies that you shouldn't have your friendly units touching each other now, which makes sense, keeps it nice and clear what is supposed to be a separate unit. And there are some situations in the game where it will say that to prevent this from happening, you can actually nudge units apart. Specifically, if they're not engaged in combat, you can nudge an enemy unit a little bit away. And just to make sure they're not touching, so it's clear that they're not engaged with each other. However, it does also specify in that part of the rules that you can't use that to create charge opportunities that weren't there before. So you can't then charge in and then force an enemy unit to fall back a millimetre to get out of base contact with you, and then because of that they're now in someone's charge arc. You can't do that. You can't create an advantage out of it. It's just for cleanliness of the eye view on the table, and aesthetically it's pleasing and it's nice and clean. You can see which units are locked in with what, which ones aren't, and which ones are the same unit. Just it cleans all that up a bit and actually puts it down in the rules clearly. I'm not sure how much of that was done in the previous edition. I don't think there was a lot. See, Steve should be getting his book on Friday. Yes, the books have been arriving on people's doorsteps if you've been following on the Fanatics group. I've seen lots of people posting pictures of the front cover as it drops through their door. Okay, so I don't think there's much change regarding the unit alignments or the shuffling of charging units or flank and rear charges. Still can't do corner to corner charges. So really, it feels like the same game, but with a little bit of cleaning up done. It doesn't feel like a drastically different game. As an example here, this notebook I've got only has 3 pages of pretty well spaced out notes on it for the rule changes. When I was moving from one edition of Warhammer to another, then what I found was I had about 40 pages of densely packed notes to describe all the changes, not to describe all the rules, to describe the changes from one set of rules to the next. So this is definitely a manageable change. I think anyone can get their head around this after a few games. It's not something you're going to have to struggle with for years, I think. The main issues, as I mentioned at the start, are going to be things that aren't explicitly mentioned in this book because they just don't exist anymore, and people act like they do exist and then continue playing in that way. Let's see. Matt says, Crystal Pendant, I think that's impacted by it too. That is true, actually, and when we get to the artifacts, we can talk about that as well. But yes, because that is one that affects any units in face contact. So the fact that you are not supposed to leave them touching when they're not engaged is quite a big deal there. So that makes it nice and clean as well. Of course, there are ways you can prevent units being nudged apart a little bit, and I'm not sure whether it would be feasible to try and game it somehow so that a unit couldn't drop back a millimetre, or whether you just shuffle everything away a millimetre, even other units that are touching it. So you can't trap something in there, so it is still touching a unit that then explodes. But we're getting quite complicated there. So, the proximity to enemies, you still, when charging, you don't have to stay 1 inch away from enemies, but at other times you generally do. And let's see what it says about the nudging here. This nudge is for the sake of keeping engagements clear and is not enough by itself to expose an otherwise exposed flank. There you go. So you can't gain an advantage from the nudges. So whether that would include gaining an advantage from blocking a nudge happening, because you could keep units touching, I don't know, that might be one for the FAQ there. That would be gaining an advantage. Okay. And multiple charges, don't see any difference here. I'm not sure whether in the second edition rules it was as clear as this regarding how much of each unit should be overlapping the edge, because I remember it not being clear with some people, and when you charge in 2 units, people just assumed you have to share equally, but it spells out here that equally means an equal fraction of those units. So if a third of one unit is hanging over the edge, a third of the bigger unit on the other side should also be hanging over the edge, that kind of thing. So that's clearer than I remember it being, but I'm not going to check the second edition books to make sure it wasn't like that already. Because it was just, I think it was kind of implied in second edition book, but the wording wasn't as crystal clear as it is here. Countercharging, so you can countercharge against any units that are engaged against you, which means that you don't have to pull back an inch before countercharging one of them. You just stay in your position or turn to the side if they're in the flank and just go straight into the countercharge, which is going to speed up the game a little bit because you're not having 2 units just bouncing off each other constantly, having to measure to make sure it's exactly an inch, so no one's gaining an advantage by slowly edging across the table a millimetre each turn, which I have witnessed. I'm sure it's not intentional, but it does happen, and it has affected objectives sometimes. I remember one game I had where I was certain one of my units was comfortably within range of one of the objectives, but because we weren't measuring exactly 1 inch between the units after each combat, then the combat was slowly moving further away from the objective each time. So it's going to prevent anything like that from happening. That will be nice and clean. And any other thoughts on any of these issues raised so far before we move on to page 24, which is the terrain section, which has taken quite a significant change in certain areas as well. So any other thoughts, drop them in there. Anything else that's not clear to anybody, or anything that's come up in your brain that you want to unleash on the world, drop it in the chat there, and we'll go over that as well. So, terrain. Now, there were some issues with terrain in the previous edition, namely the fact that different types of terrain behaved in different ways, and that just got a little bit confusing. There were certain types of terrain where if you were touching it, then you pretty much ignored it. There was other terrain where you had to be more than 50% on it, and it was a little bit muddled. Now it's much more streamlined. There are certain bits of terrain that are still different, like obstacles, for example. I can understand them behaving in a different manner to other terrain. But there are certain key points that I've noted down here. So, first of all, is the fact that units that are on top of a hill, you no longer completely ignore any units of equal or lower height than the hill who are standing between you and your target for line of sight purposes and for cover purposes. It wouldn't have affected line of sight anyway, but for cover purposes, they can now grant cover. So infantry, archers standing on a hill, for instance, shooting over some goblins at some knights, there may well be cover involved now. So if you are a height 2 infantry person standing on a height 3 hill, you're now going to be height 5. So let's say there's a unit of goblins standing behind some knights. So the knights are going to be height 3, the goblins are height 2. So the height 3 unit, you can actually see over the knights to the goblins because you're taller, but you are going to be giving them cover because the height difference isn't 3. And that is the magic number here. So if the difference between the height of you and the height of the intervening obstacle, shouldn't use the word obstacle, that's something else in the rules, the height of the intervening obstruction, shall we say, which could be terrain or it could be a unit, if the difference is 3 to what you're shooting at, then I just confused everyone there with my wording. Okay, let's spell this out clearly. So, there's a height 2 unit and there's a height 5 unit behind them. You want to shoot the height 5 unit. It's not getting any cover because there's a difference of 3. If there's a height 3 unit in front of the height 5 unit, the difference is only 2. So, therefore, it doesn't matter. There is going to be cover there. And all the hill does is just boost your height. It doesn't allow you to ignore the units in front of it. So it's easier to get cover, is the gist of that. Which is nice. If you're approaching a unit on a hill, you're no longer just going to be ignored. And nobody likes to be ignored, especially when you're trying to provide a cover or screening a unit behind you. Also on the terrain is, let's see, so when your leader point is in terrain, that terrain no longer blocks line of sight. So if it still provides cover potentially though. So if your leader point is just dipped into forest or a hill, you can see through it. However, that isn't going to stop it providing cover to the unit you're shooting at. If you just step forward into a forest and then fire through the forest, there's still going to be cover given to the unit on the other side. If you just dip your leader point onto a hill and shoot the unit that you can now see over it, they're still going to get potential cover from the hill. Unless they're ridiculously tall or the height is ridiculously short, or the height of the hill is ridiculously short. So that's quite clean, I think, just from the leader point. You no longer have to worry about whether there's 50% of your unit on the hill to see over it. It's just uniform across the different kinds of terrain. It's all about the leader point. Because previously with woods you could have your toe dipped in and see through it, but with a hill you had to have 50% to see through it. So they were both kinds of terrain, but classified in different ways. So that's more clean than it was before, I would say. And charging off the hill is something that's been mentioned a lot. You get thunderous charge for that, unless you're a flyer. If you're charging with your unit that's on the hill to a unit that's not on the hill, you get thunderous charge, which is nice. However, that's where the majority does come in, because you're only technically on the hill if you have the majority of your unit on top of the hill. So with just the leader point, you can see but with the majority of the unit, you are on it. And another thing that's interesting as well, not only can your leader point be dipped onto a piece of terrain for you to see through it, then if you dip any part of your unit onto a terrain feature, the enemy can now see you through it as well. So if you're pivoting around and leave the corner of your unit sticking onto a hill, the enemy can now see you. You'll probably get cover from that hill, but they can actually see you, which is very interesting, because you have to be more careful the way you're positioning your units in and around terrain now. So that's the way I've read it, and the way I've seen it explained by others as well. Let's see. Visibly Riley says, still don't get why flyers don't get TC1 when they lose flight and charge down a hill. That is an interesting one. That is something that's specified, that flyers don't gain that benefit to charging down a hill even when they've lost their ability to fly through some means, being disordered, for example. And I could say maybe they don't want anyone gaining an advantage through being disordered. That's the only thing I can think of there, because a flyer sprinting down a hill with its feet, you would imagine, would have the same ability. Although with those big wings, if there could be kind of a hindrance if you're charging in, act kind of like a parachute to slow you down when charging down a hill. So, never know. What about magical flyers that don't have wings? Well, I don't know. That's one. Ask the rules committee what the logic was behind that, I think. But I would suggest they wouldn't want anyone gaining an advantage through becoming disordered. And in that situation, you certainly could. Let's see. Anyone else in the comments? Mr. Steve says, hindered by their wings flopping around. Yeah, that exactly. And he's here for the expertise, apparently. Let's see. Visibly again says, I'm guessing it's a bookkeeping issue, but Devastated already does that. Well, there is that. We are going to get to Devastated at some point soon. Right, anything else on terrain that I want to bring up? Well, the fact that there's no height 0 anymore, and it just says in the book that all terrain is automatically height 1, plus 1 for every inch of height, roughly, on the terrain feature. So everything is going to be height 1. So as far as I can read it, there's going to be no flat terrain anymore. If anyone's found that mentioned somewhere in the book, then let me know. But as far as I can tell, all terrain has a height to it now. So everything will be able to provide cover. No such thing as just this little patch of difficult terrain is completely flat. Everything is at least height 1. So everything can potentially provide cover. Which, if that's the case, it'll clean things up nicely, because it was always annoying before games where you'd go through and say, well, this little field here is going to be height 0 difficult terrain. Oh, but in the last game I played it as flat. Well, but I was on this table here and I played it as height 1 difficult, and I played this as height 0 and that as flat. It was always a little bit of a nightmare. Mr. Steve says flat is still in. Where is that? We're on page 24 at the moment. Where is the old flat terrain mentioned? Lakes are considered flat, just no height 0. So flat is still there in that case. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Rivers and ponds will be completely flat. Right, such as rivers and ponds. It specifies rivers and ponds there. So something that is difficult or impassable for the purposes of it being water or a swamp or something like that. But I would say generally anything that has any visible height to it, even like a field that's just a piece of rug, a bit of carpet that you've turned into a field, I would say that should have height to it now. I would say the only things that would be flat is something that actually is completely flat, essentially. I've actually spotted it here on the drawing line of sight section, which is at the top of page 25. Some piece of terrain such as rivers and ponds will be completely flat and never block line of sight. As always, these should be agreed with your opponent before the game. Yeah, so there is flat in there, but I would like to see it less widespread than it is now. to be honest, because very rarely do I see a piece of terrain that is genuinely flat. Everything has a little bit of height on it. And I think to keep things simple, flat is one thing that was annoying, but it was mainly annoying because there was also a height 0. And 0 is nothing, flat is nothing. They should mean the same thing, but they didn't. So it definitely cleans things up, the fact that 0 has been removed. So it goes from flat 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's definitely a lot easier than having flat and 0. I think we can all agree on that one. Anything else on terrain we need to touch on here? I'm not sure there is. Just having a final look here. Okay, moving on to shooting, and there are a couple of shooting changes, a couple of quite major ones as well. So, if anyone has any more questions about terrain or comments, drop them in there as well. But as far as the ranged phase goes, the biggest change, as far as I'm concerned, is the breath weapons have completely gone, which is quite a big game changer, quite literally, because a lot of units had that rule previously, so that's a lot of units that are now changed in quite a significant way. So there's not just a kind of an extra layer of shooting, whether it's a normal shooting attack or a breath weapon or a spell. Now it's either shooting or it's a spell. And some of the spells, there are some differences in the spells in what kind of modifiers affect them from spell to spell, but we'll get to those a little bit later. So breath attacks, totally gone, so you can just apply all the rules of shooting to every ranged attack that isn't a spell. Makes perfect sense. Just going to take away some confusion, I think, because there were still people who weren't sure whether breath attack suffered any modifier for shooting at an individual. So all that's going to be nice and clear now. It's just regular shooting attacks, but anything they want to keep in the spirit of a breath attack, they can just give steady aim, for example. So they can move and they can shoot without any kind of penalty, which is what breath attacks did previously. But there was also all of the kinds of layers of madness. So things like war trombones can now suffer multiple modifiers, more so than they could before, and they will be modified from shooting at individuals as far as I can tell now as well. And overall, I like that change. It's not something I immediately thought of when someone said, how would you streamline Kings of War? I wouldn't immediately jump to get rid of breath attacks, but it does seem to work. At least from first glance. We'll see how it plays out in time, but I think it's definitely nice and clear now. Another thing is that there's more variety of range with bows now, I think. Because before you would have fast cavalry that would have their 24-inch range and they would dance around and shoot you all day and you could never catch them. But I think nearly all of those, if not all of them, have had their bows reduced to 18 inches now. The fast cavalry type units, for example, the goblin sniffs. So shorter range, meaning they have to actually get closer than a lot of units' charge ranges in order to shoot. So they may have to put themselves in peril. You can still keep them safe, you can do your shenanigans, you can move around because they're going to have nimble and steady aim and all that good stuff. Because nimble is separate from steady aim. Now nimble doesn't allow you to shoot and move without any kind of hindrance. Steady aim totally separate. Let's see. Sean says, what happened to the AOS content? Well, I haven't played any AOS in a long time, so it seems silly to try and talk about it under those circumstances. If I get more games in, then I'll definitely continue firing out content on any game system that I'm actively playing. Visibly says, yeah, breath attacks change is a pretty positive one in the games I've played so far. Yes, that keeps it nice and easy. Matt says, going to kill goblin lists. I don't think so. Because, at least with me, the war trombones were obviously a big part of the way I played the game. I would have the war trombones and I would have the diadem of dragonkind often on a flagget as well, so I would have lots of breath attacks in there. And the way I would use them would be to push them up behind my battle line, and if the enemy were to come out on top in any of the battles, the war trombones would just emerge from behind my dead trolls and just say, you know what, you've won, but you're heavily damaged because of that war of attrition, and now eat flaming trombone flamethrower death, and you can very much still do that. Most of the units I would have been targeting would have occasionally been in cover, so I would have been hitting them on 5s, but that would still be the case now. It does make them slightly less useful for turning round and gunning down individuals that landed near you, usually flying ones, but that just means that they are slightly boosted, now that breath attacks can't do that, but there are still spells to target them with. And the breath attacks would still fancy their chances hitting on 5s, because you tend to have quite a lot of dice with the breath attacks previously, now just the shooting attacks that have usually the 12-inch range and steady aim. So war trombone spinning around on the spot, still going to be pretty scary for any individuals that have landed nearby, so they're not totally safe. Let's see. Raphael says, Kings of War is all you need. Well, I wouldn't go that far. I don't think anyone can just survive on one game. You gotta be playing several at a time, I think. I don't think I'd survive with just Kings of War. I also need my Dead Zone and Dreadball, and I would also like to be playing quite a few other games at the moment. Let's see here. Raphael says, did Mantic contact you with some freebies for 3rd edition? I can exclusively reveal that I have not received a big bag of Mantic freebies for 3rd edition. The only thing I have received is this juicy rulebook. So if anyone wants to get onto Mantic and say, Andy's channel inspired me to spend just untold amounts of cash on your products, you should really send him just huge boxes of your stuff to reward him for generating so much business for you. If anyone wants to send them emails like that, then feel free. And let's see, where were we? Okay, we were on breath attacks, weren't we? And the lack of breath attacks. And the variety of range on the bows now, with the short bows for fast cavalry. There's also, I mentioned earlier that when you just dip into terrain that you can now see through, but you don't ignore the terrain as far as shooting through it. So if you just dip into the forest and then shoot out of it, the unit you're shooting at, which you can now see, is going to get cover from the forest. However, if you issue a halt order to that unit, so if the leader point was already in the forest at the start of the turn, or if they've been surged into the forest in some cases, which would allow them to have issued a halt order, then they can fire at units they can see through the forest without any cover. So it takes them a turn to kind of get their bearings, aim through the woods, aim through the trees. I can see why that makes sense, actually. So there is a benefit already being in the woods, which also opens up the option of you being shot and attacked. So just sitting behind the woods and then dipping in there. So that's, who would that be a nerf to? Units that would be moving and firing without penalty before, so you would look at, again, things like Goblin Sniffs, which were probably too good before. They could hide behind the woods and then just dip their toe in and then shoot you without any kind of penalty on the other side. Now, there would be a penalty. If they didn't start their move there, they would have to issue a halt order for that. Let's see. Wayne is praising Raphael's painting ability, which I'm going to back up there. There is some magnificent paintwork from Raphael out there. And anything else on shooting that we want to touch on? Cover, actually, this affects shooting. So previously, when it came to difficult terrain, if half or the majority of the unit was inside the difficult terrain, then you could get cover. And now, from my initial reading of it, it's changed so that that's no longer the case. It's now just if your ranged attack passes through the terrain or the other obstruction for more than 50% of the facing you're shooting, which was the case with certain pieces of terrain before. For example, blocking terrain, it would need to be blocking more than 50% of the facing that you were aiming at, whereas difficult terrain, you had to have your majority in it to gain cover. So I think that's been streamlined now. If anyone disagrees with my reading of that, then drop it in the chat, but that's how I initially read it here. And I'm obviously not going to go through out loud reading the entire rulebook, so there's going to be a few things that I've missed, but I think that's how it works now. If anyone's watching this after the fact as well, then you can leave those comments down below. And anyone who's watching this later can look down there at your comments, at the pearls of wisdom that have been dropped down there, which of course are going to be replied to by not just me, but I'm sure other members of the community as well. We'll want to get some debate going down there on any of the questionable things that come up in the book. Hopefully there's not too many of those. I've seen a few spelling errors, typing mistakes, and there's one unit stat that's a little bit off, that's a mistake, but there's not too many actually. It's nothing like when my Dungeon Saga Kickstarter pledge arrived and the rulebook had no page references in it. It was just, for more on this rule, turn to page XX. And every single time there was a page mentioned, it was always XX, because they'd just printed out the wrong version of the book, or whoever was responsible for the printing of the book had printed out the wrong version. So there was a little sheet of paper that came with it that said, this is what the page reference leads to. But they did eventually get a correct copy of the book, and I believe everyone got that. I certainly got the correct copy as well. So maybe my rare misprinted version, if I hold on to that, maybe that'll be worth millions at some point in the future if everyone else threw theirs away. Wayne says, I think he's asking if this is my preferred game. I think it pretty much is now. I play a lot more Kings of War than anything else, and I delve and probe more deeply into this game than anything else. And I would put that down to probably the tournament scene, and playing in a lot of tournaments and getting into looking at the rankings and seeing where I am, seeing how many points I got for that event, and winning trophies, and all these things drive enjoyment. That and the fact that there are lots of people near to me who want to play Kings of War, so it's easy to get games of it. And that applies a little bit to the likes of Dead Zone as well. There are quite a lot of people nearby with an interest in Dead Zone. And any game really, if there are people around me that want to play Bolt Action or Age of Sigmar or anything, or Relics even, if anyone is alive that still wants to play that game, even though it's kind of in limbo, anyone wants to play any of those, let me know. You're around the Manchester region. Okay, so where are we now? I think we've just finished on shooting, unless there's anything else here. So it does point out, like I mentioned earlier, that if there are 3 levels of height difference, then there is going to be no cover. So a difference of 2, there will be cover. 3 or more, no cover. Visibly says, Ogre Warrior Regiments are perfectly fine at Nerve 1224. I would actually like to see a game played with the Ogres at Nerve 1224. It would be interesting to see all that wavering going on. To see how that affects the game. That would actually be quite funny if someone wanted to do a battle report with Ogres with those stats. I would be all for watching that. I'm not sure I'd actually make it, but someone out there might want to. Okay, so I think we're going to turn to page 28 now, which is the melee phase, or the melee, or the melee, or the melee. I've heard it pronounced all of those ways, but I generally say melee. So, the melee phase. And what notes have I got on this one? So, mainly the 1-inch bounce, which was covered in movement as well. So, after combat, you're not bouncing off an inch. You don't have to get that 1-inch marker out and make sure that the unit is the exact distance away. Just leave it where it is, and then at the start of your turn after you've been charged, you can choose if you want to bounce off an inch, or if you don't, you can just stay there and fight. So that's shaving time off the game, which is always good, especially if you're on the clock and you had a habit of games maybe running close to the timer. When you want to stay in combat, no bouncing away at all. So that is nice. Anything else on combat? Yes, actually, there's something that could be quite significant that I spotted here. And I feel like this wasn't in 2nd edition. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm actually going to go and get the 2nd edition rulebook to see if that's in there. We're on page 28 right now in the 3rd edition, but I think this is so significant a change, I have to check to make sure it wasn't there before. So I'm just going to walk to the other side of the room and grab the nice big, not quite as big as that one, second edition. And it's in here somewhere. There we go, I've found it. Okay, this one's not big actually, because this is just the gamer's edition of the second edition rulebook that we've got here. So, let's just compare the size of these. So, gamer's edition, so it's a bit of an unfair comparison. But let me look here, because I'm looking at your options for your regroup move after combat. So this could be quite a significant change here, if I am correct and that this was not in second edition. So regroup. So here's what you can do. In second edition, you could stay where you are and pivot around the centre to face any direction. Move directly forwards, D6. Yep. Move directly backwards, D3. And that is it. So yes, it is a change, because when we go back to where we were here, you'll find on page, where are we? 29, you can now move directly sideways, left or right, D3 as well, which is quite a significant change. That's a very big change there. Visibly says, talking about that crab move, crab walk. Yes, you can now go sideways, which is a huge deal, because when you're doing multi-charges, for instance, you would have units that are pressed right up against each other, and it would be very, very difficult to pivot them because they're touching. So you would try and overrun with one of them, they wouldn't go far enough, they'd still be stuck next to each other, and you wouldn't have room to do much pivoting at all. Now you can move a unit sideways, so you're going to get at least an inch of sideways motion there, up to 3 inches, and that's going to allow you a lot more options when you're regrouping now, which is quite significant, I think. Let's see, Wayne says, it's the only channel I'm subscribed to that covers Mantic. Well, that's high praise indeed. And of course there are no other channels that you need for your Mantic content other than mine. I'm sure there are a few. If you really want to diversify your viewing habits, there are a few good ones out there. But certainly not for Kings of War. This is the place to be for the red hot, juicy, sizzling Kings of War tactical, in-depth probing. Fluffy says, is there going to be a Gamers Edition of 3rd? Yes, I think the Gamers Edition is actually in the 2-player starter set at the moment, which gives you, I think, is it Northern Alliance and Night Stalkers in that new box? I think it is. I'm not sure whether it's available separately at the moment or whether it will be, but we shall see. But at the moment, I think it's only available in the box. If I'm wrong, someone can correct me down there. So, quite a big deal. Moving sideways after combat, very significant for freeing up when you've done your multi-charges, and potential game changer there. It's going to create a lot of different strategies, because if you previously relied on, I know I've done it a few times, I've set up a situation where I want my opponent to multi-charge me, so I've put a unit out in front that won't be killed by one unit. They have to multi-charge it, and I've positioned units to the left and the right of that. Now, previously they would have then been stuck touching each other. It would have been very limited in what kind of pivoting they could do. Often they would have to leave flanks and rears exposed to some of those units that were looking into the flanks. It's now going to be slightly easier for them to manage that situation because they now have the option of going sideways. So it will be easier for them to avoid some of those traps, or it'll be more difficult to set them up because you're not going to be as wedged together after combat with the units that also charged in. So quite a big deal there. Okay, so and that's something that I didn't actually spot until my second read through on the rules, that sideways crab walk after combat. It looks like a tiny change, it's just one tiny little line in there, but that is quite a big deal. Okay, Anything else on the melee phase? Well, it mentions disordered, and the fact that you can't then shoot if you're disordered and all that good stuff. So I think that's the end of that. So let me turn over the page here and we're on to nerve tests. So if anyone has anything else to add on the melee phase, or close combat as you may like to call it, then drop that in the chat and I will refer to it. Okay, so nerve tests. The main difference here is going to be, maybe the only difference, is going to be the devastated rule, which has already been covered quite a bit. This one that was leaked out intentionally, I think. And that is that when you've suffered an amount of damage that exceeds your routing limit, but the unit has not suffered a rout result, so they're not dead, but they have taken enough damage that they should be dead, then they become devastated and they halve their attacks, unit strength, and spell stats. So we already knew about that. But let's see. So what's interesting about that rule? Well, the fact that it's not that easy to get. It's not just, well, this unit is now on +1, that means they're devastated. You have to actually get above that point. So that's not going to factor in rules like brutal. So you could get someone to a +1 when you're still a few points off actually reaching the devastated limit. So it's not just when you roll a +1, they're now devastated. You have to actually get the damage really high to do this. So that's going to be interesting to see that in action. In my one game, it never actually came up because any units that reached that point died. But there are other ways to reach the limit as well, other than just being killed a lot and then being +1. There are ways you can absorb damage without actually having to take a nerve check. There are certain rules that make you damage yourself, and very often they don't require a nerve check afterwards. And at least in 2nd edition, there were spells you could cast onto units that wouldn't draw a nerve check out of them, but could potentially do damage in some circumstances. So we'll see if those still apply in a minute as well when we get to spells. Anything else on nerve? I don't think so. So we're on to page 32 with war machines at the moment, for anyone following along. Raphael says there are some new units for Abyssal Dwarves. Are you going to kit bash convert them or wait for original ones? I'm going to wait for the new Abyssal Dwarf models because I'm actually still painting Abyssal Dwarves. Where are my decimators? I've actually got 3 empty bases here, ready for more decimators to go on. And they're sitting on the painting table at the moment, being worked on. And there they are. Let's see. Can we get a nice close-up on these decimators? Let's see if we can get it to focus really close in on this. There we go. Looks very shiny in the hand department at the moment, but nowhere near finished. Still plenty to do on them. So I'm going to have plenty of them, enough to make a horde or 2 regiments. And I'm also working on my Dragonfire team now as well, because one thing I was wondering about with the Abyssal Dwarves was whether the Dragonfire team would change its base size. And I can reveal that it's no longer considered cavalry or an individual. It's now considered basically the same as a war trombone. It's just a war machine, 50mm square base, which made sense anyway, because who could fit that on a cavalry base in the first place? That was just madness. I would love to ask whoever wrote that rule what they were thinking, whether they had no idea what the model was going to look like when they wrote it. I don't know. But anyway, so we are on the War Engines page, that's kind of relevant here. And moving on, they still have the rule where if the war engine is on a bigger base, you can't expand its front arc, which makes sense because you'd be able to gain an unfair advantage from having a mortar that fills the entire back of the table. And it would be able to see the entire board and shoot everybody. So you still have to draw the little lines on there to show where the front arc is if you're using a bigger base for a war machine. Makes perfect sense to me. And I am definitely going to wait for the new Abyssal Dwarves, because I've seen some pictures of the infantry, and they look very tasty, so I'm going to add those into the army that I've got so far. And I'll probably get some more of the old models as well. Which ones in particular, I don't know, maybe a couple of the other war machines that I don't have. I only have a mortar and the Dragonfire team, so maybe I could get one of the rocket launcher, or the light mortar perhaps. there are some very interesting entries in the Abyssal Dwarf army list, which we'll get to when I do my full video on the Abyssal Dwarf, my deep probe of the Abyssal Dwarves, which will come at some point. Okay, now we're on to individuals, and I've got a couple of notes on these, which kind of already been covered in one of my previous videos, but we're going to go through everything here as well. So individuals are either mighty or not mighty, in which case they are yielding. So yielding individuals can't prevent enemy units from passing through them, basically. And they can't prevent units from taking their disengage move out of combat if they are one of the units involved that could have helped prevent that. Yielding individuals can't do that. Yielding individuals can't be passed through if you're disordered, though. So if you're a yielding individual who can fight a little bit and charge in and do a little bit of damage, then you can still block units up. But if you're just that standard bearer that was just hanging around to inspire and bane chant people, and then in a last-ditch effort to win the game, on invade, for example, you just throw them in front of the last enemy unit and hope that they can just stand there and block them. It's now very, very difficult to block enemy units with these individuals because you can move through them, and as far as I can tell, you can pivot through them as well. And all you have to do is end your move clear of them. The yielding individuals. Mighty individuals, they behave the same as they did before, and you can't pass through them because they're too mighty. You're not just going to march straight through a vampire the same way you would a goblin with a flag. Let's see. Wayne says, how does the Kings of War lore compare to the Warhammer lore? Well, I haven't really looked into the Kings of War lore that much because it was the rule set that originally attracted me to the game. So there's a lot of that I haven't even read. So if you want to come at it from just a gamer perspective, it's generic fantasy enough so that you probably don't even need to look at the fluff if you don't want to. But I am reliably informed that the fluff has taken a significant boost in this edition, and it's actually interesting now to people that didn't find it interesting before. So if I do read all that, I will take a deep probe into that as well, and maybe compare it to Warhammer and some of the other worlds out there. But in general, I haven't bothered with the fluff yet for Kings of War, and I have just played the game. It was because I was originally interested in it as a rule set alongside Warhammer initially, and then as a replacement for Warhammer. So it was more the rule set that interested me rather than the world. I believe Mantic were the miniature line they created initially was to allow people to get cheap models to use in their Warhammer armies, and then the rule set, I believe, came a little bit after that, or to accompany the models. So let's move on. Where are we? So we're still on individuals. Anyone have any comments on individuals at all in there? You can still overrun individuals. You can still overrun mighty individuals as well. You just can't move through them. And you still can't double or triple your attacks with an individual, or you can't double and triple your attacks when attacking an individual. And so the only thing with the yielding is that because you can't land on top of that unit, it is possible to kind of block in the enemy with them, but you'd have to use multiples of them or combine them with other units to give the opponent nowhere to put the units that would be legal. And that's the only way you could really prevent them passing through. Visibly Riley says, I liken Mantic's new lore to be like their latest kits, a huge improvement. But I don't think Warhammer comparison is fair just yet. That's probably going to be the case because Warhammer had many, many, many years and lots of money put into the backstory, and just a huge beast unto itself, the Warhammer lore. It wasn't, you could detach it from the game entirely, which has kind of been the case now for a while with Warhammer, and people still like the lore and they will go for all the products around the fringes, like the licensed PC games, for instance, and the novels. People are still interested in those. So I'm sure it'll take a while before Mantic are able to get a world that's considered on a par with that kind of thing. It'll take a lot of time and resources, and we'll see if they're ever in a position to devote enough to compete on that kind of world building level. Visibly Riley, is charging individuals still the same? Basically, yes, you still do the same thing with individuals when you charge them. They still turn to kind of face you to align with your unit, and then you will slide down to center up with them as much as possible. The same as before. That works the same way, as far as I can tell. And I think with that, we're going to be on to the special rules section now. So let's see. Raphael says, the Kings of War has its own law. Not much comparison. Orcs are orcs, ogres are ogres. Basileans are arrogant people with alliance with gods. Yep, I don't know much about that because I never read the old fluff. So I may look at the new stuff though, since I've got this big meaty mammoth of a tome to sink my fangs into. I may actually delve into it. Okay, moving on to special rules now. And the first one that you'll see on the special rules page on page 35 is the aura. Aura X. So, X refers to a special rule. So an aura, when a unit has an aura, it'll grant that special rule to any units within 6 inches. And as far as I can tell though, inspiring does not count as an aura. If that's wrong, let me know, but as far as I can tell, it does not count as an aura, which is quite important for a couple of things later on. But first of all, auras, inspiring is not one of them, but if you have an aura, you'll grant that special rule to anyone within 6 inches. And so for the example they give is, if you have aura thunderous charge +1, then you'll gain the thunderous charge, but they don't stack. So if you have 2 lots of aura thunderous charge +1, you don't gain +2. They don't add up with each other. If they're auras for different rules, then of course you can have one of each, but you can't stack up the same rule as a result of auras. So if you have an artifact that gives you a special rule, and there's an aura in effect nearby that gives you +1 to that special rule, I think that would still stack, but it wouldn't stack with another aura. So there were rules in the game that followed the effects, the rules of what an aura does now, but it's just laid out exactly what it is and how it works now. So it's clean. They don't have to specify with each rule exactly what it does. They just say, this is an aura, here's the special rule it grants. This is how auras work. Nice and easy. What else has had a change here? So there are several rules actually that lower your nerve, or either lower your nerve or essentially put +1 on nerve checks against you. So there is brutal, which is the same as it was before. There's dread, which was already there, which has the same effect really, but it's like a negative aura effect. And there is shattering as well, which is the shooting version of brutal. However, brutal now has an N next to it, so it's possible that there can be units with brutal 2 rather than 1. And it does specify on brutal and dread and shattering that they do not stack together though. So, for example, on dread it says, if an enemy unit is subject to both the brutal and dread special rules or the shattering and dread special rules, the attacking player must choose to use either the brutal, shattering, or the dread modifiers. You can't apply both of them at the same time, so you can't just stack up those negative modifiers, which is important to note. So if you have an army with a lot of brutal, for instance, like ogres, then it would be kind of pointless taking dread item, for instance. Okay, what else is important to cover on here? So duelist is an interesting special rule that allows you to double your attacks against individuals in melee. So things like vampires, I think, have that. And there are items that grant you that rule as well. So if you want to be an individual hunter, then you would want this spell, this ability, should I say. Can be potentially very useful, I'm sure. Another thing to note that's obviously not mentioned because it's an omission more than anything is the fact that fly does not automatically grant nimble anymore, which is something we already knew was coming. And it does say, though, that while disordered, a flyer that also has nimble will lose both of them while disordered. And does nimble specify that you lose it? However, nimble on its own is only lost if you're disordered in melee by the phalanx or the ensnare special rule. So if you're a flyer, it's easier to lose your nimble than if you're a non-flyer. But you have to actually have nimble as well as fly for that to come into effect, because fly isn't attached to nimble. So, I'm not sure whether ensnare caused you to lose your nimble before if you were disordered by an ensnaring unit, but phalanx and ensnare will cause that now. So it's difficult for those nimble units if you're taking a lot of that stuff, and hopefully that will encourage people to take more units of things like spearmen, which you would expect anyway with the prevalence of thunderous charge availability on the battlefield now, since you can charge down off hills and gain thunderous charge, so having phalanx units to approach hills with might be very beneficial there. Let's see. Visibly Riley, the only stack is with the Ravenous Lizard, as far as I know. Yeah, the whole -1 to your nerve thing, I think with the Ravenous Lizard, it's considered a separate rule. It doesn't use like the word dread or brutal or anything like that. I think it's just its own thing, so it would stack. See, Visibly says, yes, ensnare did also cause you to lose nimble as well if it disordered you. Okay, good to know that both those rules caused it previously as well. It rarely ever came up in any of my games because I haven't used a lot of phalanx units in a long time, and you didn't see a huge amount of them, really. But I think you should see them more now. Okay, especially actually because phalanx units are often like your big infantry blocks, your big hordes, so they've got a bit of a boost from the new charge measuring system as well. So that'll be another reason to see units like that in the game. Okay, where were we up to? We've done duelist, we've done fly, phalanx. So phalanx has another little boost as well. So other than taking away thunderous charge from units that charge you in the front, there's also -1 to hit for cavalry, large cavalry, and units with the fly special rule that make an unhindered charge. So that's important because it doesn't stack with being hindered. So if you have your spearmen in the woods, then the cavalry charging you are not going to get a double punishment for being hindered and the phalanx. So it's like as if you're carrying around a little bit of difficult terrain with you when you're being attacked by those particular units. It's important to note that this doesn't apply to chariots, though, as far as I can tell. So that's an interesting one. You would think that anything that applied to cavalry, large cavalry, and flyers would also apply to chariots, but maybe not. So that doesn't apply to them, unless that's a mistake and it should be in there. But it just seems like it doesn't apply to chariots. So that makes them very useful as well, not just for taking away thunderous charge, but also against any kind of cavalry or flyers. So just fill your army with phalanx and watch people just fly into it, and unless they can outmaneuver you, of course. So again, people have to be careful with those powerful, fast units now, which is what you want, really. You don't want people having units that are faster than you, and also they can just willy-nilly charge you in the front without any fear of having an issue. They can still just easily kill you. Okay. Anything else on special rules? What have I got next? Wayne says, so Kings of War is a far better game than Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Well, better is obviously subjective. Some people preferred the more in-depth, kind of crazy, random ridiculousness that you would get in Warhammer Fantasy. And there is obviously a lot of depth in that. But there's also a zillion more rules to learn. And it's difficult to compare the two because not only are the rule systems completely different, it's also two totally different companies. With Mantic, you just get the rulebook and then the supplements that come out, which update every single army list at the same time, whereas Warhammer always had the one army is the new hotness. So that army is going to be the most powerful. And if it's not, then whoever wrote the new army book would generally be the most hated person in the community for a while. But typically, you would get what you generally refer to as power creep. They usually call it when you have kind of staggered releases of armies like that, whereas Mantic tend to give you the rules for everything all together and don't tend to just put out individual units or armies on their own with nothing else. So it's difficult to compare, but overall I think Kings of War is just much cleaner and easier and faster. That's the best way to describe it. Whether you prefer one or the other is just down to taste. But there are a lot of benefits to Kings of War that are kind of if you're trying to be neutral on it, then there are a lot of benefits to Kings of War in the gameplay. Much cleaner. Okay, so hopefully videos like this will inspire anyone who's been lingering around on my channel for years and not actually checked out Kings of War. Because for some reason when it's a live stream, people are more tempted to click on it. They want to feel part of the community rather than just a battle report that's going up later that they don't have any particular attachment to. If it's a live stream and they can comment along and I can actually read it, and even if they're not interested in the game system, they tend to join in as well. So, where were we? Which special rule were we up to that I've made a note on? Pot shot is a new one as well. So units before that struggled because they had the reload ability, you've got things like the ogre shooters, where they really struggle to shoot if they were forced to move, i.e. they couldn't shoot at all. So if you could get into their flank, then they have one turn to decide, do I shoot something in front and then get flank charged, or do I turn round and lose a turn of shooting? Now, they have a little bit of a way of mitigating the negatives there, because they can do what's called a pot shot, which is where you can move and shoot, but it's -2 instead of -1 penalty. So if you're turning round and shooting at a little unit of gargoyles or something and you get a couple of hits, which you might with -2, then you could possibly still take them off. So you have the ability to defend yourself a bit more with those units, as if ogre shooters needed any kind of boost. But yeah, I think that kind of makes sense, and I'm not sure which other units have that because I haven't looked through all the different army lists yet. Okay, next is Shattering. We already talked about that. And the other notable new rule, because most things are pretty much the same, is Wild Charge, of course, which allows you to add inches onto your charge. And it's not adding it onto your movement, only when you charge. So if you're just marching across the battlefield, no benefit. But if you want to charge, then the unit is going to get excited and they are going to just extend further than ever. So Wild Charge is sometimes a set number. So it'll sometimes be just Wild Charge 1 or 2 or 3, and sometimes it'll be like D3, for example. And you roll that before you decide who you're going to charge, so there's no weird risk element involved in that. There's risk element in the enemy positioning. Do they think, that unit's got Wild Charge D3, so that's potential. They could charge up to 15 inches if they roll 3 on that D3. So do I put myself 14.5 inches away and risk that there's a 1 in 3 chance that I'll be within their charge range? Because if I stay further away than that, there's a chance I won't make it over to that objective by the end. So there's a bit of risk taking there, but not with the actual charge itself, because you know how far your charge distance is before you can decide who you're going to charge. So you'd roll that and then make your decision after you know the result. So that's a very interesting one, and it's only obviously random at all if it has the Wild Charge and then a random number. If it's just Wild Charge 2, then you know exactly how far they can charge, so you wouldn't have a thought process like I just described. And it does make sense, because there are certain units that you would think would get more enthusiastic about charging than marching. Things like berserkers, or anything that's like a feral beast of some kind, perhaps. Okay, moving on from special rules. If anyone wants me to look at any of the special rules because maybe there's been a change that I haven't noted, then feel free to mention it and I'll go back and look. But we're going to move on to army selection, because there have been a couple of changes there. So in the unlocks, and it's pretty much the same, but there are some subtle changes that you may not notice at first glance. So previously it would be that a horde would unlock a certain amount of things, a regiment would unlock a certain amount of things, and that's still the case, but there are more differences between the types of hordes or the types of regiments that you take now. So, when you take a unit of infantry or heavy infantry, so a goblin or an orc or a dwarf, then it'll unlock, I'm looking at the table here, so if you take a horde of them, this includes cavalry hordes as well, and it's the same for legions, then this would unlock, you could take 4 troops of something. You could also take 3 other things. You could take a hero, a monster / titan, and a war engine. However, when you look at a horde of large infantry and large cavalry, you'll notice that only unlocks 2 troops of anything, and it only unlocks 2 of the following: a hero, monster, titan, war engine. So it unlocks less if you're taking large infantry and large cavalry instead of regular infantry. So ogres are going to have less unlocks. If you're taking a full troll army, like I've been tempted to, you're going to have less unlocks. So the troll army backed up by a ton of war machines isn't as feasible to make anymore, especially because lots of the other units that I would often accompany the trolls with are now irregular. So that's something to factor in as well. So a subtle change there, and I like it, I think. There's one thing I want to read more closely on here, because with the infantry and heavy infantry it says monster / titan, whereas the large infantry and large cavalry says monster, titan. So does that mean you can take one of each of those? Let's have a look here. So each horde of infantry, heavy infantry, up to 1 hero, up to 1 monster or titan, up to 1 war engine. Okay, and then for the large infantry or monstrous infantry or large cavalry, you can include 2 of the following: up to 1 hero, up to 1 monster, up to 1 titan, up to 1 war engine. So yes, you can include a monster and a titan when you take large infantry and large cavalry. So there is actually a little benefit to taking them. You unlock, by taking the big monstrous stuff, you unlock more monsters and big juicy stuff, which actually kind of makes sense. So I can dig that. And let's see, any other notable things here? So taking a large infantry or large cavalry legion actually unlocks slightly different number of things. That unlocks 4 troops rather than 2 compared to the horde. So you get more unlocks if you take a legion. And the only one I haven't mentioned, I think, there so far was the infantry, heavy infantry or cavalry regiment, which just unlocks 2 troops and then 1 other thing. So a hero, a monster / titan, or war engine. So yeah, there's a few subtle changes there. So a few differences in the unlock ability based on what kind of regiment or horde or legion you take. Infantry and heavy infantry and cavalry legions don't differentiate at all, though, from hordes. They have exactly the same unlocks. It's just large cavalry and large infantry that have a different unlock table between the legion and the horde. And I can dig that. It's a slight layer of extra complication, but I don't see why it would be a problem, especially since most people would be making their armies when it's updated through Easy Army or Army Builder or something like that, which generally locks in the rules for the army selection anyway. So it's not something you often have to think about too much, because you put in all the units you want and then the message comes up and says, you have too many of this. So you take something out until it tells you your army's okay. Let's see, is rallying finally in the main rulebook? Raphael wants to know that, so I'm going to check because I'm pretty sure it is. I don't see why it wouldn't be. Rallying N. Yep, there we go. Rallying is also not considered an aura as well, which is another important thing. So rallying and inspiring, and very inspiring as well, while having the effect of an aura, they are not classed as an aura, which is very important because there's actually an artifact that boosts aura range by 3 inches. So that wouldn't affect rallying or inspiring or very inspiring. Or there may be other things in here as well. Dread isn't considered an aura, but that's a negative one, but it still doesn't count as an aura as far as I can tell. And anything else? There's another thing actually called the Cloak of Death, which automatically does damage to nearby units. I would assume something very specific in the book has that. I haven't seen any units with that yet, but that affects units within 6 inches, but that is also not an aura, as far as I can tell. So, yeah, there we go. Those are not auras. So we just did the army selection and the unlocks of troops and speciality units. The duplicates in the army list are still the same, so if you're up to 2,000 points, below 2,000 points you have less, but once you hit 2,000, which is generally the tournament level, that's when you can have 3 of each of something. Irregular units don't unlock anything, and you can't take them as allies, pretty much. And anything else to note in here? Let's see. Did I put down anything else for unlocks? Nope, so I think we can go straight to artifacts now. So we are going to be on page 45 and onwards. There's a few pages of artifacts. There's not that many artifacts, actually. I would expect future books to possibly add more. There's not a vast amount of them. So I think there's enough, though. You don't need a billion different artifacts that no one uses. People tend to flock to 1 or 2 of them, and I can already spot some in here that are going to be quite commonly used. So, obviously you can't take the same artifacts more than once in an army, same as before. So I've noted down a few that jumped out to me as something notable. So the first one I made a note of was the Sacred Horn, which is the one that puts an additional 3 inches of range on all auras for that unit. So, anytime you have an aura, it's going to affect anyone generally within 6 inches unless it specifies otherwise. Taking the Sacred Horn for 15 points allows you to put that out to 9 inches. That is quite a big deal. And the one that jumped at me was looking through the Goblin list and seeing the Goblin King has an option to take an aura of Headstrong. So you put him in amongst your trolls, give him the Sacred Horn, suddenly any troll unit within 9 inches of him is going to be Headstrong. Not just any troll unit, but anything. But it's especially important for trolls because they get wavered so much. So that's quite a big deal. Let's see. Steve says large infantry regiments don't unlock now. Let's see. Yep, that is true. Large infantry regiments don't unlock anything. So if you were into taking your regiments of ogres, which I never really saw. I can't think of any large infantry regiments that I ever saw on a regular basis. Werewolves, I typically saw them in hordes. Trolls, always in hordes. Ogres in hordes. I'm not sure who that's going to affect exactly. But anyway, they can't unlock things. So yeah. Back to magical artifacts. So, we were just talking about the Sacred Horn, boosting auras. And that's a good one. I think that's going to be quite commonly taken. Let's see. Blood of the Old King is a notable one as well, because that was in one of the Clash of Kings supplements, and then it was taken out, which is interesting. But because now it's back, and it's only 15 points. Blood of the Old King, only 15 points. That thing was great. It gave you Elite and Vicious for 1 turn. Let's see what it does now. Well, it's still once per game, gives you Elite and Vicious, only in close combat though. For 1 turn. However, there's a downside to Blood of the Old Kings now. For every die re-rolled, the unit receives an immediate point of damage on itself. But you don't need to take a nerve test, so that means it's fine. So what that means is, because with Elite and Vicious you're re-rolling 1s, not all of those re-rolls are going to convert into extra hits. So Blood of the Old King is actually going to do either exactly the same or more damage to you, more additional damage to you than, or more damage to you than it does additional damage to your opponent. So it's really good, but it has to be used at the right time and on the right unit. It's very good being able to just say, okay, I'm going to be Elite and Vicious for this turn. But you have to be sure that the unit that's using it isn't going to put itself at death's door through the use of it. If it's a unit that has a zillion attacks and not much nerve, you're taking a very big risk there. If it's a unit that has high nerve and not that many attacks, then it's not going to be that big of an issue for you because you'll take the damage. But if you're taking that damage, that means that you were re-rolling some dice, so it's actually helped you. So there are units that it would seemingly be wiser than others. If you've got a unit that's already pretty dead and beaten up, and one more decent hit's going to kill it anyway, and you've got Blood of the Old King on that unit, you might as well cash it in, because it doesn't matter how much extra damage you take, you're going to die anyway. You won't need a nerve check from this, and you could kill something. So it's going to need more planning than the old Blood of the Old King. Before, it was pretty obvious. The first time you get in combat, if it's a half-decent unit you're fighting, use it, because you might not get another chance. Whereas now, you have to really think about it. If you need that unit to die in front of you, use it. If, even with using it, you might not kill the unit, it's a bit of a risk to take, because you can end up re-rolling quite a few dice and damaging yourself there, and putting yourself in harm's way. So you've got to be careful with it. It's a very interesting one. For only 15 points, it's definitely one that you'll have to plan out which unit you're going to use it on, and pick their target wisely. If you can use it on a unit, or if you can put that artifact on a unit that's going to be able to get into combat, use it, and then be safe afterwards. If you're in a battle where there's no other units nearby to counter you afterwards, then that's okay, especially if, for example, you're a regenerating unit, or you've got heal nearby, so you can heal them up before they go back into the fray. But if you're just in the middle of the battle line, suddenly one of your units is going to be heavily damaged after using this, potentially. So you've got to be careful. What else have I made a note of? Okay. Oh, by the way, Visibly Riley says Shamblers are one of the large infantry units that people would take in regiments. That is true. That's one of the few units that you would see in regiments, large infantry. So they are not going to unlock anything for you. Okay, so no, that was quite important as well, because often people would take Shamblers as allies, I think, and then they would be able to unlock a hero to maybe surge them with or something like that. So that could be an issue. Okay, the other artifacts I wanted to touch on, the boomstick is one of them, because previously that would grant you the lightning bolt, and it still does. But if you already have the lightning bolt, it increases the value of the lightning bolt by 3. Previously you had the spell, or the artifact, the Fenulian Amulet, that would give you a boost of 2 to your lightning bolt. This boosts 3. So it's better value because you're only paying 5 more points for that extra point of lightning bolt on top of what the Fenulian Amulet did, because I think that was 25 points, I seem to recall. And if that was 30, then it's just got a free boost of an extra 3 on your lightning bolt. So if you're a Goblin Whiz, this is like the dream, this item, because you're taking lightning bolt pretty cheaply if you're a Goblin Whiz, and being able to double your lightning bolt for only 30 points. Why would you ever say no to that unless there's another artifact that you really want on here? Then there you go. You know what? I'm going to double check how much the Fenulian Amulet costs in the rulebook to make sure. I'm pretty sure it was about 25 points. Let's see. Got the old rulebook out here. Scarlet Moors, Fenulian Amulet. Yep, 25 points. And you could only apply that if you already had the lightning bolt. So the boomstick is now kind of a dual purpose. You can use it to give someone lightning bolt, but boosting the lightning bolt of someone that's already got it quite cheaply here, I think, is a big boost. I can see taking a Goblin Whiz, running around probably on a flea bag with the boomstick to get up to lightning bolt 6. Just running around, lightning bolt 6 on everybody, having a great time. That's going to be fun. I'm definitely going to be using that a fair bit. What else have I made a note of here? We've got the... I've made a note of the Mournful Blade, so that grants the Duelist special rule, which is the one that allows you to double your attacks against individuals in melee. And that's 15 points. So certain individuals... This can only be taken on individuals, by the way, so there will be some individuals in the game that look like they're really good in combat, but they don't have Duelist already. Stick this on them and suddenly they become individual hunters, which is very tasty indeed. As individuals, they're one of those units that are always a little bit tricky to get rid of, generally, because you're never doubling or tripling your attacks on them, wherever you charge them from, and shooting at them is always more difficult as well because of the -1. So units with duelist hunting each other down, will that be the future? We'll see. What else have we got here? So Wings of Honeymaze have had a bit of a change as well, which was already released to the public, and that is, was it 40 points before? I think it probably was. And it gives you fly, puts you to speed 10, but it decreases your defense stat by 1 now. So if you're going to put this on your hero and just try and fly around the enemy doing some damage, you're going to be on lower defense, so you're going to have to be even more careful with whoever you stick the Wings of Honeymaze on now. So does that mean we'd maybe see it more on units that don't want to get into combat? Perhaps maybe you'll see it on more casters that are just getting into position to cast spells. Maybe somebody that has Wind Blast flying into position to blast a unit around, potentially. But lowering your defense quite significant, but the ability to fly very significant as well. So it's a nice little balancing act there, because Wings of Honeymaze for certain armies, and wasn't necessarily an auto include, but you did see it a lot. Anytime, particularly used to see it on the Flying Pharaoh and the Vampire, when it was defense 6, you used to see the wings on that. I certainly took the Flying Vampire with defense 6. So maybe we'll see, I'm not sure whether we'll see more of the Wings of Honeymaze or less of it in this edition. Probably a little bit less because of that slight nerf. Maybe people will just have to be a bit more clever with it. We're nearly at the end of the artifacts section here. In fact, I think we are at the end of the ones that I picked out as particularly notable. So if there's any more you want me to comment on, then drop them in the chat right now, and I'll go back and look at them in a moment. And we're going to move on to spells now. We've only got a couple more sections to cover here, and then that'll be the end of this one, and after that you'll have to wait for my army specific videos to come. So onto the spells, and a few notable things here. First of all, there is no Alchemist's Curse, and I don't think there's a spell that has the same effect anywhere that I can see. If there is one, then let me know really quick, but I don't see one. Or if there is, then it'll be something that's unique to a particular character later on, but I don't see it in this book. So all those defense 6 units, you can stop panicking, that's gone. Okay, and one notable thing here is the modifiers that affect spells. So Fireball hits on a 5 against units in cover or stealthy, which is the same as before. Lightning Bolt, however, only hits on a 5 against units in cover. Lightning Bolt does not care about stealthy. So if you're stealthy, lightning is still going to get you. You can't hide from lightning with stealth, but you can hide from fire with stealth. I'm sure there's some logic behind it. And the other spells that are affected by anything, Icy Breath is affected by cover. That hits on a 5 when there's cover involved. And Icy Breath, if it does 1 point of damage, then the unit gains the Frozen special rule, which lowers their speed, I think. I'm going to look at the special rules, because I think Frozen is -1 to your speed. Is that in the special rules section? There we go. This unit with Frozen special rule has -1 speed until the end of its next turn. Okay, there you go. So -1 speed, but it can't drop. Frozen has no effect if the unit's speed is already 4 or lower. So you can't be slowing down those Abyssal Dwarves that I'll be putting out on the battlefield. Abyssal Dwarf infantry, you can't slow them down with Frozen. But it's going to be lowering speed, so that's a new one. And I've seen that on a couple of the dragons. and it seems to be quite common in the Northern Alliance, from what I've heard. And there are other things they've got that will synergize with units that are frozen, I think, as well. So that's an interesting thing there. And what else have I have here? Hex. I'm not sure whether Hex is a new one, because to be honest, I generally stuck to the same batch of spells throughout 2nd edition, and most of the people I played against did as well. I didn't come up against some of the more rare spells, but Hex, essentially, instead of causing damage if one or more hits are scored, then the enemy is hexed, and every time they score a hit with a spell until the end of their next turn, they take 2 points of damage. So that is quite significant. It's not going to stop them from casting a spell, but it's going to make it very, very annoying for them to do so, and they're going to have to damage themselves to do it. So potentially interesting. A nerve test is not required, though, when damage is caused by this spell, which is typical of anytime you're taking damage on your own turn, you're generally not taking a nerve test, because that would require your opponent to roll dice, which is something that doesn't tend to happen on your turn. And let's see what else. Enthrall as well. So Enthrall is like a reverse wind blast, pretty much. For every hit scored, the target is pulled 1 inch directly forwards towards the spellcaster, or sideways or backwards towards the spellcaster, whichever arc they are in. It can only be enthralled once per turn, so you can't just be repeatedly enthralling a unit, zigzagging them around the battlefield to get them into weird positions. You can't do it on units with speed 0. So there were effects in the game like this. The Trident Realms had a unit that could do this. I'm not sure if it was called Enthrall, but that's 18-inch range, which is the same as Wind Blast, so it is just the reverse Wind Blast. Instead of blowing them away, you're sucking them closer to you. And any of the spell ranges that have changed at all? Lightning Bolt still 24, Fireball 12. Doesn't look like there's been much of a change. Weakness, I'm not sure whether that was 24 inches before, but it is now. So that's -1 modifier to damage enemy units, like reverse crushing strength. And so that doesn't do damage, it just, if it scores a hit. I'm not sure whether that was 24 inches before, I don't think I actually used it. Kevin says, just saying hello, I actually love your stuff even though I don't play Kings of War. I was an early Mantic buyer though. Loved Warhammer Fantasy, always pondering starting Kings of War. Keep up the good work. Well, now is a pretty sweet time to be diving into Kings of War head first, because the other players aren't going to have any edge over you. Brand new version of the game with a new starter set with new exciting spicy models to salivate over and sink your teeth into as well. So now is a very good time to be jumping on board, I would say. Kings of War. Very exciting times ahead. Right, the other spell. There is, which ones did I want to talk about? Mind Fog. I think that was in there, but that was one of the spells that was added. And 36 inches, I don't know what the range on that was before, or whether it was even called Mind Fog, because I don't think I ever used it. So you can force a unit to take a nerve test without doing any damage, basically. So if you've got a unit that's heavily damaged, but you've got nothing to shoot at them, then you can use this 36-inch range Mind Fog. You don't have to be close enough to use something like a Lightning Bolt. You're really far away. Just think, right, I'm going to mess with their mind a bit. They're already wounded, they're bleeding. Let's put some doubt in their mind and make them run away. So, very potentially useful, that. Lots of other things like Surge and Drain Life seem to be basically the same. And the other thing with Drain Life, if you cast that into melee, they don't have to take a nerve check at the end of the ranged phase, which is the same as before. There are some unique spells as well, including Blizzard and Blood Boil, Martyr's Prayer, which you will know from 2nd edition. But they're now unique spells, meaning that no army can ever have more than one source of them. And there are certain units that have them by default, which I haven't seen any of because I haven't really looked at the other army lists, just mine at the moment. And Blood Boil, I haven't seen that anywhere yet either, but that seems to work the same way as it did. Blizzard has piercing 1 now. I don't think it didn't have any piercing on it before. So it's quite powerful. 30-inch range. Was it 30 inches before? I don't even remember now, even though I've been using it. And there's also Bastion. I don't know who has this spell, but you can boost the nerve, basically, of your units and give them rallying as well. And Veil of Shadows. And if it scores a hit, the spellcaster gains the Aura Stealthy special rule until the start of the player's next turn. So this is a spell that you would cast on yourself, so I wonder who has that. There'll be someone in there that does. But you can never have more than one source of these spells. So if you have a caster that has the option to take it, you would only be able to take it with one of them. And if you have a character that has one of these spells by default, then you wouldn't then be able to take it as an option for another character, even if they have the option. So those spells, unique, they obviously think they're powerful, and they don't want them being spammed. Makes sense. Wayne says, there's a starter box. I always thought it was just a rulebook. Might have to have a look. That interested me. Yes, it's got the Northern Alliance and Night Stalkers in there, which are ridiculously nice models. Mantic's model production has been upped. The quality of it has just gone up and up and up over the last few years. And now is definitely the time to jump on there. There's also, I think, the Northern Alliance Chimera is the most ridiculously nice model they've done so far, according to most people. And I think that is actually causing delays in the warehouse because so many people are ordering it, they're having to cast more of them. That's the word on the street anyway. So that is a very tasty model. I think Northern Alliance are going to be quite popular because they're the new hotness. Night Stalkers have been out for a while now, they're old news. It's all about the frozen Northern Alliance right now. Although I think I may do Night Stalkers as my next army when I eventually finish my Abyssal Dwarves, because I do have some random Night Stalkers in my possession at the moment. Okay, I think we've finished on the spells for now. So if anyone has any more comments on spells, then let me know. And we're going to dive into the scenarios now. So first of all, an important thing to note is that some of the scenarios have disappeared. There are still 12, as there were in the last Clash of Kings book, but the scenarios that have disappeared are Occupy. So that was the one where you would have an objective in your opponent's half that was worth getting, and there were then lesser objectives along the centre of the battlefield. So that's gone. And what else has gone? Scavenge has gone. So Scavenge is the one where there were lots of objectives around, but some of them were worth more than others, I think. Oh no, that was Ransack. So Ransack has gone as well. That's the one where some of the objectives were worth more than others. And that's gone presumably because there's a new feature in some of these scenarios that replaces the need to have objectives that are worth more than others, which I'll go into in a moment. And Scavenge was the one where you generate tokens from a predetermined spot on the battlefield. So you have to stand near this, and then at the start of the turn, if you're controlling it, you can generate a token. That's gone as well. So, what's come in to replace them? Well, I'll tell you the scenarios that are still there, first of all. Pillage is still there. Loot is still there. Push is still there. Dominate, invade, control, raise, plunder. They're still there. Kill is still in there. We don't want to play kill, I'm afraid. I can understand why it's in there, and I can understand why some tournaments use it, but I don't like it. Even though any time that it really hugely benefited one side over the other in one of my games, it was to my benefit at Swords of Summer tournament, where I was playing my goblins and ended up finishing second. The last game in that tournament was kill, and I felt very bad for my opponent because my army was much more geared around killing than his. So that definitely benefited me. So I think kill, I don't like it, but I can understand why it's in there. See, Kevin says you have to get the new hotness. It's every player's duty. Yes, it is. I was looking forward to the faction videos. Yes, they will be very hot and spicy, or in the case of the goblins, very cool and icy and chilled. So there's new scenarios are Fool's Gold, Smoke and Mirrors, and Salt the Earth. So they have some similarities to them. Fool's Gold and Smoke and Mirrors use these new counters that are called bluff counters, which are objectives, but you don't know how much they're worth until partway into the game. So you place half of them each, so each player knows what half of them are worth. So you can use all kinds of crazy bluffing and mind games. You can put objectives over on one side that are worth nothing and put your army there so your opponent thinks you're going for those objectives when really you just change course with all your fast units and run away because you know that corner's totally worthless. So that's an interesting new mechanic. In Fool's Gold, you place 5 of them each on the table. You have one that's worth 2 points, 2 that are worth 1, and 2 that are worth 0. So some of the objectives that you're sitting on are going to be worth nothing. And in Fool's Gold, at the end of round 3, you find out how much each one is worth, and then you can adjust your strategy accordingly. So there is still benefit to being fast, despite the boosts to things like phalanx. You're still going to want your fast units to get around for when these scenarios come up, because you may have to just redeploy your army somewhere. Smoke and Mirrors is very similar, except that at the end of each round, each player must flip 1 bluff counter on their side of the board, rolling off to decide who flips first, and then you repeat this process until all the bluff counters are flipped and revealed. So you're going to slowly find out what the tokens are worth in that one. So very, very similar scenarios there, but the time in which you find out what the tokens are worth is very different. So I like both of those, and I have actually played one of those scenarios already as the version 3 test game I did, which was filmed in its entirety. I just need to edit it and take out rulebook pauses, sync up all the audio and all that stuff, so that should be up hopefully fairly soon. The reason I didn't stream it live is because I think it's a higher quality picture when I film it with my good camera that isn't a webcam. I may look into actually streaming some games, because that obviously doesn't require any editing, but I want to be more on the rules for 3rd edition before I do that. And I'll have to test it out, because I'm not using Google Hangouts anymore for anything, which is lucky, because that really kind of strangled the quality of video a lot. So hopefully I can get a good picture quality with a webcam, but I need to test that out. And Salt the Earth is the final new scenario, which does not use bluff counters, but you do place objectives on the table. Let's see, how many of them do you place here? Place 1 objective marker in the centre, and then players take it in turns placing objective markers until both players have placed 3 each. So there's going to be 7 in total on the table. And with these ones, when you control an objective, you can destroy it at any point. So that's very interesting, and I can understand how that's going to affect certain armies. If you've got a shooting army, if you've got a shooting unit that's sitting on an objective, the enemy looks at you threateningly. You think they're going to charge you next turn and kill you and then sit on that objective. At the end of the game, you think, you know what? I'm just going to destroy this objective. You're going to come and get it. I'm just going to destroy it so no one can have it. If you're a combat army and you're marching across the battlefield and you walk past objectives, you have that moment where you think, I'm never going to be able to come back here and collect these objectives, but my opponent's got a couple of flyers that might hop over my lines and just sit on them at the end. You can actually just completely scorch them on your way past now. So if you know you're never going to get to that point on the battlefield again, just destroy the objective. And let's see. After a player has completed their turn, they can choose to destroy any objective markers which they control, except for the central objective. And yeah, it doesn't limit you at all, because you don't have to cancel a move for that turn. It's just if you are controlling that objective at the end of your turn, you can get rid of it. So very nice. Which also means, because it's at the end of the turn, you would find out with that shooting unit if you manage to shoot off the unit that's threatening you, and then if you don't, well, you know what? No one's going to have this objective. Just like the match, whoosh, up it goes. So if I can't have it, nobody's having it. So I like that. That sounds like a fun scenario to me. 1 victory point for each one you control that's still in play at the end. And the central objective obviously isn't going anywhere, so there's still a way to win, even if all the others get torched. So that sounds very interesting. See, Wayne says, do the Forge in Trafford Park stock Mantic, and do they play Kings of War tournaments there? I have played in Kings of War tournaments at the Forge, and I've played in Vanguard and Dead Zone and Dreadball events at the Forge as well. Then Mantic stock, I think, is limited. I know they do some Mantic stuff, but I don't think they have Kings of War. I've seen Walking Dead stuff there. I don't know if they have much else. I wouldn't count on them having a lot. It's not a huge shop, the Forge, but it is a good venue. It's very nice and it's very clean and it's got nice facilities. So it's good for playing events in. The shop isn't the biggest though. So if you're just going shopping, maybe it is not the best. I'm not sure if they can order things in specially though. Obviously you'd have to take that up with them. I'm not sure what their web presence is like as far as a mail order, that kind of thing. You would have to look into that. But it's a good venue. As far as stocking Mantic products, there are a few places that have been that are much better than others, but probably the number one that I can think of off the top of my head for stocking Mantic stuff is Black Dragon Miniatures, but that's in Leicester, in Hinckley. So that's obviously nowhere near me, unless I go to tournaments there. But they have a very healthy stock of Mantic stuff there. Tons of Kings of War stuff compared to the other shops. Even the really big shops, like your Element Games type places, often there are a lot of Kings of War stuff they don't have. So obviously with Element Games you can get everything ordered in quite easily though, because they're very big on that front. So if you order before you go and you know exactly what you want, but if you're just wandering around looking for kind of spur of the moment shopping decisions, then they don't have the best Kings of War stock at Element. Anything else now that we've finished the scenarios? I think that's everything I wanted to touch on here. So that is the entire rules section and the changes to the rules that I have observed. There may be a few other things in there, and especially changes by omission, which obviously I wouldn't be able to spot just by reading the rules. I would have to figure out what's not there, which is a bit more tricky. So I'm sure people will comment if I've got anything wrong in my analysis, if there's a paragraph that I've skimmed over and not picked up a crucial piece of information. So any thoughts on that, any mistakes that were made in this video, drop them in the permanent comments section if you're watching this later. And also any thoughts on how these rule changes are going to affect your army as well, which I would like to know, which I can then refer back to when I do the individual army breakdowns as well. That's going to be quite important to hear from people that actually play those armies. And other than that, you can look forward to definitely diving in nose first into the cloud of sweet aromas that each of the new army lists is going to bring, especially the armies that I play. So that's going to be the Goblins, the Abyssal Dwarves, Undead, Ogres. You'll have to wait until the other book comes out with the additional armies before I go into the League of Rordia. And all the other armies that I don't play, I'll probably compress them into probably one video where I'll just dive through those lists and give my input based on what I've observed as differences. And the fluff, if I get round to reading all that soon, I'll definitely do an in-depth probe into all that as well, because I'm sure there are some people out there that are very interested to hear how that stacks up. So I'm definitely going to have a look at that. There's some very nice artwork and maps in this book as well. Definitely a step up from previous Mantic publications. The paint work on Mantic's miniatures is significantly improved as well. Some of the old models, even I think some of the current stuff on the website, when I'm painting a miniature and I want to identify what part of it is, I'll look on the Mantic website and think, that unit I'm painting looks better than that. Which isn't something I normally say when I'm looking at the professionally done miniatures, but the new stuff all looks incredibly good and a lot better than some of those old ones. The old ones, it wasn't that a lot of them were bad, it was just inconsistency. Some of them were amazing, and then some of them just looked like somebody else had done it. So in recent times they've got more professional painters involved, I think. I think that's probably the difference. And I know some of the Mantic staff that don't consider themselves professional painters are actually very high quality painters as well. So I don't know whether some of their stuff is also in here, because some of them are certainly good enough to warrant it. I would imagine some are. But there's some very nice kind of battle scenes, like this one here. Wrap your eyeballs around that. It's very much like you used to see in the old Warhammer books, where it's a battle scene that would never actually happen in a game because you're never going to line your armies up that way, but it looks very aesthetically pleasing, shall we say. And some very nice maps for the map connoisseurs out there. And the background section is huge in this book. If you're going to get the Gamers Edition, I don't think you get any of that. So there's one reason to get the big, thick, rigid hardback in your hands. And other than that, I think it's pretty much time to wrap this video up. So drop any comments in quickly if you want to get them referred to before I end this stream, because we're going to stop very shortly. Wayne loves seeing models ranked up like that. Yes, plenty of lovely juicy artwork in the book that you'll enjoy then, if that is your bag. And I can actually sit up a bit straighter now. I think my arm's getting sore from holding up that book all this time. Obviously I don't want to just be looking straight down like this with it just resting on my lap. It had to be somewhat held up at an angle. Right. Anything else we want to touch on here from the chat? I think I've covered basically everything. Time to end this, I think. How long's this video been? See, I think it actually tells me on here. 2 hours, 5 minutes. That's quite a lengthy, in-depth probing, isn't it? I don't think anyone can feel cheated by the depth of this particular probing session. I think everyone will have been deeply satisfied. Let's see. Wayne says, take it easy. If I see you in the forge again, I'll buy you a can of Fanta or something. That sounds good to me. Something suitably orange would be very appropriate there. Raphael is painting lots of dwarves for Kings of War 3rd edition. Hopefully lots of infantry, because dwarf infantry is supposed to be the hot new thing. They've got quite a bit of a boost. And not just because the other things have been nerfed, but also because they have been legitimately boosted as well. Graham has enjoyed this video. So that's nice. Okay, let's bring up the beautiful thumbnail that I put together there. Kings of War Deep Probe, 3rd edition rules changes. There you go. Hopefully that kind of cheeky face expression there, that's going to bring in untold viewers, including people that have spotted the accessories in the background, like the copy of Cheeks, the Diagnosis Murder Season 3 DVD, the Ginger Dead Man 2. Is it Ginger Dead Man 2 I've got there, or 3? It's 3, in fact. It's Ginger Dead Man 3 Saturday Night Cleaver. I do have 1 and 2 somewhere as well, but they're not on the shelf. There's also Birdemic, Shock and Terror in the background as well, just some of my favourite DVDs there. And some various kind of pop culture icons as well in the background there. Okay. Mr. Dan Kane, hello to you. I'm sure you've been listening along intently. I think you have probed so deeply that I have felt it. Yes, I'm sure all the audience have felt the lasting effects of this deep probe into their minds, of course. The probing of the book, which has penetrated the inner sanctum of your brain and left its mark permanently in there. So this is knowledge that you can never lose again, I would say. It's left an indelible mark on your psyche, if nothing else. Okay, let's end this video now. Don't forget to like it, obviously. Don't forget to subscribe if you're not already, which I'm sure you are, of course. And don't forget to check out all the links in the description, the various social media shenanigans going on down there. Don't forget to throw just big piles of cash at me, because that's how the internet works now. People make videos and then you click on their Patreon link and just send them your life savings on a monthly basis. I think I'm up to like $14 a month or something in there at the moment. So not to be sniffed at indeed. And stay tuned for further Kings of War 3rd edition content. All that remains to be said, I think, is good night out there, whatever you are.